and then I'll just wait until it pops up there. So there'll be a small delay.
Great.
Oh, there we are. So it looks like we are now live on Facebook. So welcome everyone. My name is Carrie McClelland. I am the Wildlife Biologist at the Department of Environment, and I'm happy that you could join us today here on Facebook Live. I'm sorry we can't get together and do more of these events in person where we can chat and hang out and even go on walks. But if we all stay safe, then hopefully we can get back together in the spring when that happens. I'm joined tonight by Tom Jung, who's a senior wildlife biologist at the Department of Environment. And I've worked with Tom since the beginning of my career in 2009 at the department. He's been there for quite a few more years than that. And we started working mostly on bats, but more recently, he's invited us out to help out with some of the pika work that he's been doing high in the Alpine. And it's been just a true pleasure. It's beautiful because one of my favorite things about collared pika is that they only like good weather. So it means that we only have to do the research when it's nice weather. If it's raining, then we have to go home. Oh, shucks. Okay. So that's worked out really well for me. Before we get started though, a few housekeeping things. This presentation and the Q&A is being recorded, so it will be available afterwards on our Facebook page, as well as we'll export it and post it to YouTube, so you can share that with your colleagues or with students or maybe your mom, who knows, who would like to see this talk. And if we do get cut off, which sometimes happens with our internet and technology, you'll just have to stay on our Facebook page. So don't linger watching this video because we can't reconnect to the same video, but go to the Facebook page and then a new live stream will pop up as soon as we can reconnect to wrap everything up. So other than that, I'm going to hand it over to Tom.
Great. Well, thanks, Carrie and Scott, for inviting me to talk about collared pika. When I was putting together this presentation, I realized, had a bit of a dreadful realization that I actually don't get an opportunity to speak publicly about pika very much. So I'm very much appreciative to talk about them. So maybe just a little bit of background about my work with pika. First thing I'll admit is I'm not a pika expert. My experience here in the Yukon has been on mammals. I work on both big mammals, bison and caribou, and sometimes bears, and small mammals. So as Carrie mentioned, bats and mice and voles and snowshoe hare, as well as even some of the middle-sized mammals like lynx and wolverine. But pika is fairly new to me. I've only been working on pika for the last 10 years or so. I don't claim to be a pika expert, but I very much have been intrigued by the animal and I'm learning. And maybe the things I really like so far about working on pika is I really like the species. I think pika are really neat animals. I honestly didn't know a whole lot about them before I started working on them, other than, just seeing them while I was out hiking and reading a little bit about them, but never really delved too much into their ecology or evolution until more recently. And more recently being 2009 is when I started working on pika, kind of haphazardly, without a lot of focus at the very beginning. But they are an interesting species, and I'll be talking obviously about pika, so I won't say why I think they're interesting. I think the question about pika, how to monitor them, their conservation needs, is really important. So I find that quite interesting. It's one of the things I really like about pika. Undoubtedly, the landscapes like you see on your screen where pika occur. This is just behind the campground at Kuswa Park. The landscape's stunning. What can you say? Pika choose nice places to live, and I certainly enjoy visiting them. And that leads to the next point: is it's interesting work. So not just the question itself, but the actual field work we do, I find quite interesting. I like it very much because we have very much taken an approach that we want to be hands-off, non-invasive. There's reasons to capture and collar and handle some species, but to answer the questions that we believe need to be answered. But for pika, that doesn't seem to be necessary. So I very much like that we don't have to capture them or handle them. to do it. And, it's, again, being able to work in such beautiful landscapes, and, we put on lots of miles on our boots. It's good exercise. I really like doing the work. And finally, I'd say, we have a great group of people we've been fortunate to work with on Pika over the last decade or so. And I think that that's been a really big motivating force for me, and a really big reward is working with a great team of people. And just to follow up on the last point in a moment, I'll just list some of those. Just a bit of an overview for today. I'm really just going to give a bit of a whirlwind talk on the evolution and the ecology of pikas, and some of their conservation needs, and wrap up a little bit with how we're trying to monitor them to understand their conservation status a little bit more. And as I said before we start, I'd just like to give a thanks to the great group of folks who seem to come out year after year to do some of the pika monitoring, including Carrie here has been one of our best pika surveyors out there, but a whole bunch of people from the government of Yukon, some really key people from the government of Canada, in Tombstone Park, where I'll talk about a little bit later tonight. We've been fortunate to have the Friends of Dempster Country quite involved in doing some of the work. And we've had some of the people that I would say truly are pika experts, like David Hick from Simon Fraser University, and Sean Morrison, who did a PhD with David at the University of Alberta. And maybe if I were to point out one person other than Carrie that's really been a key person in the pika work, it's Pia Kuka, who works here as a biodiversity biologist. And, I'll cut right to the chase, right at the beginning. I know some people are probably just here because they want to answer the question, is Pikachu a pika? I'll say yes, Pikachu, it was modeled after pikas in Japan. And there's quite a fan club, as you know, for Pikachu. But also, there's quite a fan club for pikas in Japan. And Pikachu is modeled after a species of pika called the northern pika that occurs in Japan, Siberia, part of China, and I believe it even goes over into Mongolia. But Pikachu really is named after it. So if you only came to the talk tonight to answer that question, hopefully we've got that out of the way and you can get on with your evening. I will follow up a little bit more on kind of what is a pika. And I think it's pretty common to think that pikas are related to mice and voles. So if you look at this picture of an American pika and this meadow vole, they obviously look quite similar, at least to me. There's a lot of similarities in how they resemble each other. Their pikas are a little bit bigger, but their body size, their body shape is quite similar. However, meadow voles and other mice are not related very closely to pika, which may be a bit surprising. Pika are not related to mice and voles. So I just want to sort of get that out of the way. Instead, actually, American pikas are much more related to a species that they may not look quite as similar to, and that's species like the eastern cottontail rabbit that occurs in eastern North America. They may not look very similar, but evolutionarily, they are quite close. So yes, pika are more related to rabbits and hares. And just to delve into that a little bit more, the group that pika belong to, so all mammals belong to different orders of mammals. So there's the carnivores, there's the ungulates, there's the bats, the whales, and so forth. There is also a group called the lagomorphs, and that group is made up of two subgroups, the Ocotonidae, which are the pikas, and the rabbits and hares, the Leporidae. So they constitute the lagomorphs. And they all come from a common ancestor that, according to the fossil record, emerged probably around 55 million years ago. That was the ancestor to both pikas and rabbits and hares. So in biology parlance, we call that a monophyletic lineage. They come from the same ancestor. but of around 37 to 50 million years. Scientists aren't quite sure exactly where it is, but it's in that range, they believe. They split, and leporids went on their own way, and okatonidids, pikas, went their way, and started to evolve into their own respective groups of species. But they do come from a common ancestor, and that's how come they are evolutionary linked and related. And just a bit about the diversity of pikas globally. Again, there's always some give and take or some disagreement in what's a biological species. There's some people that are lumpers, some are splitters, some hypothesis we don't have complete evidence for or agreement, but the long and short is currently we believe that there's 34 to 37 species of pikas that occur uh, around the world now. And as you can see from this slide here, they all look really similar. And I believe, I don't know exactly what all 34, 37 look like, but all the ones that I've seen all look really similar. They're very similar looking animals. It's not like some other groups like, say, the carnivores, where you can have some very different looking carnivores in terms of size, shape, whatnot. Pikas all seem to be pretty similar in what they look like, no matter what the species is. Maybe the other point I'll say before I move on about the diversity is that historically, there probably were even yet many more other species of pika that have come and gone. And some of them, many of them are no longer around. They're just represented in the fossil, as fossils now. And one other thing I'll say is, so the pictures that I showed a moment ago all showed pikas in alpine habitats, in talus slopes, and that's if you've been out hiking in the mountains in the Yukon, that's probably what you're familiar with, is seeing pika in talus slopes. There are a group of pika, however, that live in more steppe type habitats or northern prairie habitats, and they burrow in the ground rather than in talus. So here's one of those species, the plateau pika, that lives in Mongolia and China, I believe, and it lives in the ground. But again, just not to get confused, although they share some very similar life history characteristics and way of making a living as species like Arctic ground squirrels. Again, they're not related to them whatsoever, although they have very similar habits. And biologists, we call that convergent evolution. And that's when species from different evolutionary histories kind of converge on a common solution to a problem, like living in a certain environment. It's sort of like when different people will have the same idea, but very different people from different origins or backgrounds and maybe tackled it, but they come to a common solution for a problem. And that's sort of how convergent evolution worked. But my main point here is just to draw the attention that this diversity of pikas globally have sort of two different ways of living, either on a steppe habitat like the plateau pika here in the ground, and that's similar to how our Arctic ground squirrel in the Yukon lives, or up in the mountains. And up in the mountains in talus slopes is the major place where you'll find the most diversity and most abundance of pika. So just speaking again about the distribution, this is a map that shows where these 34, 37 species of pika occur around the world. And the darker shaded areas is where you find them. So in North America, there's two patches in the West, including up in the Yukon, and I'll narrow in on those in a moment. But there's also this really big patch in Eastern Eurasia, where most of the species occur. So in North America, currently there's only two species, and the other 30 some odd species live in Eurasia. So there's quite a bit of diversity in Eurasia. And our best knowledge now, based on the evidence, is that pikas actually originated in Mongolia and China. They probably spread across the Bering Land Bridge into Beringia. And that's where our two species come from. Again, Previously, going back, several million years ago, there was other species of pika that lived not only in Eurasia, but also in North America. And they no longer occur here, but the origin was in Mongolia. The animals have moved across and formed other species across Eurasia and into North America even. Just a little bit about the two species of pika that occur in North America. So again, we have the collared pika that live in the Yukon and Alaska, and a little bit of the Northwest Territories in the Mackenzie Mountains and Richardson Mountains, and a little bit into the coastal mountains of British Columbia, just sort of nudging in there. And then the other species we have is the American pika, and they occur down in the Cordillera, the mountainous regions, and the Great Basin region of the Western United States and Alberta and British Columbia. And as I've already said, these two species are restricted to mountainous areas with abundant talus. We don't have any of those ground dwelling or fossorial pikas like they have in Asia. And these two species in North America are separated by about 400 kilometers, where no pika are known to occur. And that's probably a legacy of the ice. So these two species have been separated by ice. We'll talk about that in a moment. But they share this similar evolutionary history. Just to give you a comparison to thin-horned sheep and bighorn sheep. It's not quite the same as on this map here, but it's similar, where you will have thin-horned sheep to the north of where the ice was during the last glacial maximum, and to the south of that, you'll have bighorn sheep. And presumably, these were one species at one time of sheep that were separated by ice, same with pika. And they were separated long enough that they became their own species. And these two species in North America, the collared pika and American pika, are apparently, and I say that because to the best of our knowledge, they're quite similar physically, ecologically, and behaviorally. Similar to thin-horned sheep and bighorn sheep. They're very similar in many ways. So again, if you want to think about this species pair in North America, the best analog is to also think about sheep. And what we learn about pika evolutionary history can also help us think about other species that have a similar influence of ice, like sheep. And just how these two species got separated is a subject of some interest and debate in terms of learning how speciation occurred in Beringia in Western North America and North America in general in relation to the last glacial maximum. And up until recently, there was always thought that there was this north to south origin and the north to south hypothesis, so that animals came across from Eurasia in one or more movements across the Bering Land Bridge when that was established, and that the animals moved all the way down to lower latitudes and then got separated by ice. And this is what we call the north to south hypothesis, where those that were north of the ice and those south of the ice became their own species. However, new evidence based on the parasites that found in them actually are quite interesting and intriguing, and kind of turn our thinking about speciation after the ice age, turn those hypotheses upside down a little bit. So the evidence now suggests that actually what really happened was that pikas did come across the land bridge from Eurasia. They moved down to the southern United States, southern Canada, southwestern United States, southwestern Canada, and then species evolved of pika. Some of these species are no longer around anymore, but the American pika still is. And then the thought is that the American pika actually is the one that survived, and that they recolonized, moved northward before the last glacial maximum, recolonized Beringia, the more northern latitudes, and then the ice came in and separated them out, and they became other species. So for evolutionary biologists, people are interested in the radiation and speciation of mammals, this idea of a return to Beringia is a bit unique and it's quite interesting. And we're really learning that again through pika and the parasites they harbor. So some interesting thinking about how pika got here and how we ended up with two species in North America. Okay, I'm going to move on now and leave sort of the more global world of pika and narrow in on the species we have here in the Yukon, which is the collar pika, Okatana coloris, and the etymology or origin of its scientific name. I like this one because it's simple. They're not always simple, but it's composed of two words. I'm going to mispronounce this, but Okatuna, which is actually the Mongolian word for pika, and colaris, which is obviously collared. So it's quite simple, makes sense. It's collared pika, but all pika are named after the Mongolian indigenous word for pika. And just to talk a little bit about collared pika, there's been a lot of work done on American pika, a little bit of work done on some of the Asian pikas, particularly those ones that occur in Japan, but very little work done on many of the other pika species, including collared pika. In fact, I'd say a large percentage of what we know about the ecology of collared pika comes from work done in the Yukon at a place called Pika Camp. And this is a picture of Pika Camp in the Ruby Ranges up by Kluane Lake. And this is from 2004. And at Pika Camp, they did a series of studies, studying in-depth ecology of pikas. And they was led by Dr. David Hick and some of his students. And this is David manning the weather station at Pika Camp. And they did work like record vocalizations, and they did a lot of work on marking individuals. So if maybe a bit hard to see, but this pika has a little colored ear tag, so they know exactly who that pika is. That pika may be Sally or whatever, whoever they named it, so that they could follow him or her through their life history. So for I would guess about a dozen years, pika work went on at Pika Camp, and a lot was learned. But that's really where we know all our information about pika. And I haven't mentioned it yet, but the Yukon, I think we should be quite interested in pika because along with Alaska, we're really the global stewards of this species. And I don't say that lightly. So when we think about conservation of species, it's pretty easy to think that some species are really wide ranging and maybe they might be doing poorly in one area, but that's well, I wouldn't say it's okay, but the species can handle it because they're doing okay somewhere else. Well, for pika, really, it's up to the Yukon and Alaska to take care of them because they're not going to do so well. They're not like if they're not doing well here, they're not going to do well globally. They're not like mule deer, or they're not like let's say bald eagles, or some other species that have really wide distributions. They occur in many provinces, states, many other parts of the world. Grizzly bears occur in many different countries. So the Yukon definitely is important for those species, but it's not the only place. However, for species like collared pika, and there's also a number of plants and insects that also follow in this category, they're really found nowhere else in the world other than Yukon and maybe a little bit of NWT and Alaska. So it really is important that we pay attention to these species because quite simply, nobody else will. My apologies. So now I'm just going to go over kind of quickly a little bit about the animal itself. A bit of their description. Well, like I showed on that slide before, it looks like a pika, right? All the color pika looks like just like a whole lot of other pikas. Some slight difference in the coloration, which I'll touch upon in a moment. Males and females are about the same size. They don't have what we call sexual size dimorphism. Another species I work on here in the Yukon is bison, and in that case, females are about 60% the size of males, very strongly sexually dimorphic. In other species, one that I mentioned a few minutes ago, bald eagles, the females tend to be bigger than the males. But for collar pika, both sexes about the same size. They're about 130 to 200 grams. More on that smaller side is the average. So, 140, 150 grams on average. A 200-gram pika would be a really big one. And just for comparison, red squirrels are about 200 to 250 grams. So they're not very big animals, pikas. Their body length is about 18 to 20 centimeters. And one of the things that does distinguish them from other species of pika is obviously its namesake, is they have a bit of a collar, and you may be able to see that in this photo, the whiter or lighter coloration that forms a bit of a collar around the neck. And their coat color for the collar pika is likely adaptive, which means it helps them survive. It allows them to blend into the predominant color of the talus where they're located. So you can see this kind of mottled colored rock, gray rock. They blend in quite well. And I have another photo that I'll show in a few minutes that I'll talk a little bit more about that.
If folks are interested in like seeing that on our TikTok and Instagram, I've posted a couple videos where I'm filming like a pile of rocks, and then people can't, I'm like, there's a pika in there somewhere, can you find it? And until it moves, you can't see it at all.
Yeah, that's great, Carrie. It definitely is a Where's Waldo kind of thing when you're looking for pike in the talus. You can sometimes hear them, like in this photo, where this one's just really giving it in terms of its vocalizations. But my goodness, sometimes they're hard to see. As I assume most of the folks following along that have had the opportunity to walk in pika country, whether it's in the Yukon here or maybe down in the Rocky Mountain parks of Alberta or BC, boy, they can be hard to find, hard to hear, or sorry, hard to see. A little bit about their behavior. This one may be a bit interesting or surprising. They're active year-round, so they don't hibernate. But I will say they're usually active in the winter underneath the rocks. I'm not aware of them coming out on top of the snow to look for food or anything like that. I think they'd have to be pretty desperate to do that. But they are active year-round. They don't hibernate. They're quite territorial. So you often don't see a group of pika. It's one pika typically that has a territory that they defend. And they defend by chasing other pikas or vocalizing to let them know this is my turf, this is my part of the woods, stay away. They don't move much, and that might be a reason for why there still is this big 400-kilometer hiatus between these two species of pika. They're home bodies. From the work that David Hick and his students did in pika camp is to move to move more than 100 meters or so is from their home patch is a really big movement for pika. So they don't do that much. They tend to be diurnal, and they evade predators, which they have many of, via their camouflage that I spoke about a moment ago, refuge in the talus, going underneath the rocks, being hard to find, and like this pike in the photo, by using warning vocalization. So even though they have their own territories, adjacent pikas kind of warn each other when there's a predator. And one other interesting thing, again, coming from the work at a pika camp, is that local populations seem to have local dialects. So pikas in different parts of the territory probably sound just a little bit different. And that's probably, again, because they don't have a lot of gene flow between each other. They tend to be genetically isolated. A little bit about their population ecology. They're relatively long-lived for a small animal. They live up to 7 years. Reproduction starts at 2 years, and their litter size is 2 to 3 young a year. Again, like I said, they're preyed on by many species, particularly ermine or short-tailed weasels who hunt them in the talus. And when we do our survey work, it's not uncommon to see ermine in the talus occasionally, where they do hunt pika and other small mammals. And interesting for their conservation is they occur in what we call metapopulations. And a metapopulation just means that there's these different patches on the landscapes, as represented in the diagram in the left, where some tend to be what we call source populations, where the animals tend to do well. There tends to be relatively higher density or abundance in a particular patch, and that those source populations, every once in a while, animals will leave them, although, like I said, pikas are hesitant to leave. Every once in a while, they will decide they're going to be brave and they're going to go and seek new pastures, so to speak, and they're going to go out and they're going to occupy a new patch. So amongst these source patches, we also have what we call sink patches. And those are patches where the animals don't do very well. Sometimes they blink in and blink out. There's pikas there for a few years, and then maybe for a year or maybe even several years, there's no pika until again another brave one from a source population decides to take the big walk and travel, 200 or 300 meters to the next talus patch. So these metapopulation dynamics are kind of important in terms of understanding the abundance and conservation status of pika, because they can really blink out, and sort of the fear is sometimes that they can blink out in some patches and they can stay blinked out for quite a long time, if not forever, so to speak. So these metapopulation dynamics are important. And the diagram on the right is just to bring it back to pika a little bit, is a schematic of the patches, talus patches where pika live at Pika Camp that I talked about, where David Hick and his students did his work. So again, understanding patch dynamics is important, and that leads us to the monitoring that I'll talk about at the end of the discussion here. A little bit about their foraging ecology. They're omnivorous, mostly plant eaters. They collect and store food for hay for the winter in hay piles so that they don't have to get out of the talus when it's really cold. Biologists, we call pikas bet hedgers. And we say that because they really store a lot of food. So if you're a lazy pika and you only store, kind of enough for what you think it'll take to get through the winter, well, you may be unlucky, and we may have a prolonged winter with deep snow or longer cold temperature, and your food pile is not going to get you through the winter. So rather than be risky, they tend to hedge their bets and build really big hay piles. Another species that does that is beaver, in terms of building their food caches and being bed hedgers. Pika may not be the most friendly with their neighbors. They'll often steal hay piles from their neighbors. And one other piece that I find quite interesting is that, as I said earlier, they're omnivorous. They are all known to eat birds sometimes that die on nunatucks, and I'll talk about nunatucks in 1 second here. So before I talk about nunatucks, here's a picture of an old hay pile of pika, and you can see that's an awful lot of vegetation stored by, again, one pika to get them through the winter. And this is the leftover. So presumably what was good already got eaten that winter. So they do make big hay piles that are rather conspicuous in talus slope. And for those that don't know what a nunatak is here's a photo of one in the Yukon, and one area that has nunataks. And nunataks are the tops of mountains that stick up above the ice. So it's actually believed this is where colored pika evolved, and where they evolved within the glaciers that covered most of North America when it was covered. That they existed in these mountain tops that stuck up from the tallest mountains that stuck up above the glaciers. And again, a very patchy environment. You can see why a pika has evolved to not kind of go out and occupy other patches. It's cold and inhospitable world, and they're easily seen by at least avian predators to run from patch to patch. So you can see why they've evolved it. But some great work done by local Yukoner, Kieran O'Donovan, looked at the ecology of pikas in these glacial fields, and in particular them preying on birds that may have been exhausted from migration and would land on these nunatucks to take a rest and hopefully to find a little bit of food, be it insects or vegetation, to power them up again, so build up their reserves so they can continue migration. But some of them would perish, and pikas would eat them, scavenge them. A little bit about their habitat selection. So Again, like I said already, most pikas in the world occupy talus slopes and mountains with some exceptions, but not all talus is suitable. Pikas are picky. And some of the characteristics of talus patches that are associated with colored pika presence include the rock size. They're very particular about the rock size, the rock color, again, to help with camouflage, at least that's a theory. The elevation, and this is important for their conservation, the slope, the aspect, how big the talus patch is, whether there's foraging habitat, food near or interspersed within the talus patch, and if the shrub growth is minimal. These are all characteristics that combined determine whether a patch is a good patch, and maybe even if a patch would be a source patch versus a sink patch, to use that metapopulation terminology. And here's a picture of talus, sort of really good talus for pika. And of course, you can see the pika in there, a bit hard to see. But this is sort of the rock size relative to the size of the pika that they like, and also the color. And you can see, these kind of mid-gray tones with these green and black lichens. Pika really blend in. So we've surveyed talus that tends to be really dark. We've also surveyed some very whitish talus, and I haven't really statistically tested it yet, so I can't say with any confidence, but just from my observations is those are much less likelihood, if at all, do we find collared pika. Again, they really seem to be tuned into this color of talus with this size of rock. And moving on to their conservation, here's just one example of pika. Again, it's really unfortunate, but we know so little of the 30 some odd species, close to 40 species of pika around the world, that we really don't even have a good idea of what their conservation status is. Collared pika, I'd say, is one of the better ones, but we're really struggling to have enough information to really understand the threats and the population trends to them. Here's a species that occurs in China, and I failed to mention that China, for example, has at least 6 species of pika that occur nowhere else in the world other than China. China and Mongolia being the epicenter of pika diversity. But they believe for this species of pika in China, 71% of their habitat is gone, and fewer than 1,000 are left in the wild. And again, we don't know enough to provide some of these statistics for many of the pikas, and even we're grasping a little bit with collared pika. So for collared pika, based on concerns for what's going on for pika globally, to the best of our knowledge, plus in particular what's going on with American pika, which is by far and away the most studied pika in the world, and has shown some very strong declines, although there is some debate about what the status is of American pika by pika biologists. For collared pika, there was a report done. There was an investigation, an evaluation of how well they're doing. An assessment was made by the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada, COSEWIC. That's a group that determines, or at least recommends, what are the species at risk in Canada. And that assessment was the first one ever done for collared pika, was done in 2011. And looking at the chart to the right, the determination was special concern. So special concern is a lower risk category than threatened or endangered. It really is a flag to just say that we think there's something going on here. And if we don't pay attention to this and we don't reverse any of the threats, and we don't monitor it closely and do careful management of the species, then they may become threatened or endangered. So again, not fully threatened or endangered, but on the other hand, they're also, according to the best available information, they are, here's a double negative, sorry, they're not at risk. So we do think they are at some level of endangerment. It just happens to be the lowest level endangerment, which is good. I'm glad they're not at a higher level of endangerment. So again, special concern is a bit of a flag that we should be paying attention. So that really was the impetus, at least for me personally, to get started working on pika, not really knowing a whole lot about them. I've been in the Yukon since 2000, but only started working on them in 2009 when I knew that Kosiwik started paying attention to collared pika. I thought, well, we better start looking too if Kosiwik is concerned. So the reason why Kosiwik thought they were concerned really boiled down simply to climate change. It wasn't so much that there was other human-caused destruction of habitat, or that people were causing other harms to them, to the best of our knowledge, through things like pollution or harvesting or things of that nature. But it really was climate change impacts. And the two impacts that kind of rose to the top related to the basic biology of pikas, or physiology. And quite surprising to me when I learned is that this is an animal that apparently will die if exposed to temperatures of 26 or 27 degrees. They simply cannot deal with temperatures warmer than that. And again, that may seem a little odd to us, and that does seem quite low, but it does happen. So just to draw another example, there's a number of fruit bats in Australia that every year when they have heat waves, and they're having increasingly more frequent heat waves, those bats literally fall out of the trees at 41 degrees. And it makes big news nationally across Australia when it happens. Well, this is the same with pika. Apparently, based on laboratory studies, they can't live with temperatures greater than 27 degrees. We know it gets hotter than 27 degrees occasionally, maybe not as much as we'd like in the Yukon, but occasionally does happen. But pika have a way of dealing with that. And again, that's the talus. Their talus really is the protection, and they, on those really hot periods, they go underground. They go into the rocks and where it's much cooler. The second climate change impact that's a real concern for pika is shrubification. And that's an increase in shrubbiness of the environment and talus slopes around pika habitat. So it basically renders the habitat no longer good for pika. So this is a picture of me up around Mount Nansen, a little west of Carmax. We were surveying for pika 3 summers ago. And this is a talus patch that's being consumed by shrubs, literally. And this is absolutely no good for pika. They can't see predators coming. There's no food available for them. It renders it useless. And the concern is, again, studies coming out of the Kluane area by a fellow named Ryan Danby, now at Queen's University, that the shrubs and tree line have been moving higher up in the mountains, as I'm sure most of you have heard. That's a main prediction of climate change in the Yukon, is that these tree lines and shrub lines will advance, and as they advance, they take over pika habitat, and the pikas need to move higher up into the mountains until presumably eventually, if shrubification continues, they can't go any higher. So that's been seen with American pika, is that some of the lower elevations habitats that pika used are no longer being used because the habitats become too shrubby. And I'm almost done here, but just a couple slides about kind of what we're doing and what we've been doing since 2009 is we've really focused our work on trying to monitor pika to see how well they do, to understand these metapopulation dynamics and disentangle whether there's long-term trends happening in the decline of pikas in the Yukon, shifts in their habitat use, i.e. are they moving up north, to monitor the habitat change over time, and to see if there's just this metapopulation dynamics going on, and for reasons of chance, more or less, that these patches that are not so suitable habitat, if they're just blinking out, but we still have our source populations. So we go to a number of these patches each year. There's again, long list at the beginning. Lots of people get out and participate in this, and we survey these patches. And how we survey them is quite simple. Again, this is a very low-tech effort, high energy. It takes a lot of work, but again, we're not It's non-invasive. We basically just walk through these talus patches in a bit of a systematic way, and we try to detect pika, and we detect them by either seeing them, hearing them, or finding their sign. In this case, their hay piles. And if we see or hear or find their sign, then we mark that for that year that patch is present. We move on. The surveys are done by 2 people. We sample another patch, but then we come back the next year. And the point is that this is hopefully a long-term monitoring project where we're following the same sites year after year to record and build a database of pika occupancy or presence so that we can uh, determine through statistical models whether the population is declining, remaining stable, or increasing, and importantly, what some of those factors related to how well that patch does for pikas may be, so we can know why something may be happening. And just to let you know where we do this work, we kind of have 2 approaches. One is an extensive approach where we're kind of going where we can, sometimes piggybacking on other species at risk work that's going on in the territory to sample areas for pika to get a better sense of where they occur in which situations in the Yukon. And that's sort of, for example, these red dots, that's where we did in 2020, surveying these areas. The yellow star is pika camp, just for reference. But then we have a bigger goal in these areas where we're doing repeated surveys, occur at 3 different territorial parks, Kusawa, Tombstone, and I won't try to pronounce this one publicly, but in the north, in the Richardson Mountains. And the idea is that we do repeated sampling at these parks for pika so we can monitor trends. And the reason why we have this latitudinal transect is because based on scientific theory related to climate change, we believe that there will be a trailing edge. So that would be Kuswa Park, where climate is fast making that habitat unsuitable. And then we have the center of the range, which is approximately Tombstone Park, where things should be relatively stable in terms of how the habitat's changing relative to Kuswa anyways. And then the northern park in the Richardsons up by Old Crow, we think that actually that habitat should be improving for pika, that the conditions should be getting better. So we want to see if some of those theories in terms of climate change and what we call the trailing edge and the leading edge pan out for pika, so to speak, so that we could see really, how, again, tease out what's going on in terms of the effect of climate change. And we may find things like, they still occupy Kuswa, but at Kuswa, they only occur at much higher elevations than they do Tombstone, and all these other potential hypotheses to, again, better understand how pika are doing. And I failed to mention, but when Kosiwik assessed pika, it was one of the first species that was assessed primarily at risk because of climate change. So there's lots of species that are at risk because of climate change, but it's usually climate change and those other threats. But it really does boil down to climate change with collared pika. And, we like to think about species like the polar bear as being a real icon for climate change. I'd say really pika are probably a stronger a canary in the coal mine, if you will, for climate change. So it can really give us a good clue what might be going on with other animals that rely on Yukon's alpine ecosystems and how they may be able to or not be able to adapt to changes that are going on. And this is the last thing I'll say is just a picture here to the side is just to show you some detail at Kuswa Park, some of the sites where we've been sampling. So we do try to sample about 70 to 100 sites in these territorial parks every year to, again, really be able to follow them through and build a really strong data set to understand what's going on with pika, their conservation status, and how they're responding to climate change. The million-dollar question is, what can we do about climate change? We're working on that. There are some possibilities for pika. A management plan is being developed by the federal government, being led locally here in the Yukon by Shannon Stotine. But we can't do anything if we don't build that database and get a better understanding about this species. So I apologize for that being so long-winded, but with that, I think I'm wrapping up now with my little presentation.
Yeah, no worries, Tom. It was great. And thank you so much for the background information on pika as a species globally as well. I know that was eye-opening for me. I've gone out to help you, but I'm sort of just focused on what we're looking at. So looking at it within the larger global perspective was really, really interesting. We did have a couple of questions here, and folks are watching and they want to add some more questions to the comment box on Facebook. We'll read them and share them with Tom. But this was an interesting one from Sebastian Jones, who had a good point. Do you happen to know what the body temperature for collared pika is? Like if they can't survive past 26 or 27, does that mean they just like have a much lower running body temperature?
No, I don't know that specifically, but I would hazard a guess, and I think this is probably pretty close. Most mammals are between 36 and 38 degrees. That's sort of a mammalian standard, including for us people. So I assume that they are also in that 36 to 38. Again, they don't hibernate, they don't use torpor to the best of our knowledge, so they don't vary their body temperature from that 36 to 38 too much.
Oh, okay, that's interesting. Yeah, well, if you need a volunteer to go up there and maybe like hold a pika and take its temperature to know for sure, like I'm available, and I'm just saying I can do that for you.
Absolutely, Carrie. And I would just like to thank Sebastian. Sebastian's one of the people that's been putting in years of effort in Tombstone Park to taking a real leadership role to do some of the monitoring up there. So thank you, Sebastian.
Well, Sebastian would like you to come up to Tombstone to do this kind of talk again. So maybe if we're able to get back together in person with folks, we can organize something in the summer season.
That'd be great.
I'm just going to give folks a few more, like another minute or two to add any questions they may have. So I was just wondering if it looks like the ranges are expanding, like we have that gap from glaciation in between them. So is the American pika moving up or the collared pika moving down at all? Do we see that at all?
It'd be hard to see because they move at glacial rates as well. They're quite a slow moving species. They're not like deer, for example, that do tend to be moving north, which I think they're moving north, deer, for example, because they're responding to it no longer being glaciated here. But yeah, given enough time, absolutely, the two would contact again. However, we have this confounding factor of climate change, and that
Right.
we actually expect that their ranges will be either shifting or shrinking. So for collared
Right.
pika, the range should be moving northward. We should be, according to theory, we should be losing collared pika from southern Yukon. When that happens, I don't know, 50 years, 100 years, but they should be moving. Conversely, American pika should be moving up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but you're right. If they're homebodies and they don't like leaving within 100 meters of their kind of den area, then it would take a long time for them to explore brave new worlds.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I have one really important final question here before we wrap up. They are just so adorable. Why? This is not very scientific, but why is there a pet market for them? I feel like guinea pigs and hedgehogs and all other tiny adorable creatures we insist on capturing and putting them in pet stores. And has anyone tried that with pika? Is that a thing?
Yeah, wow, that's a great question, Carrie. I'm not aware of that whatsoever, but you're absolutely right. So a lot of these other small alpine mammals do tend to be cute and enter the pet trade. So hamsters, gerbils, chinchillas, they all are also small alpine mammals. But No, to the best of my knowledge, pika are not at all in the trade, and I don't know why.
Well,
Where they originate in Mongolia and China, actually they are used as food items, and they have been used by First Nations. My understanding is
mhm.
sometimes as a bit of survival food if you're stuck up in the mountains. So they've not been pets, but they have been used as
Mhm.
a harvested species.
Yeah, I do wonder if it's the temperature thing. Like if they can't survive, in a temperature that we found comfortable, maybe that's just never been viable. Either way, I'm just very relieved that something has escaped the pet trade, and hopefully they can stay wild um, amazing sight for those of us who can hike up into that alpine and see them. So I'm going to wrap it up there. If you have questions for Tom, you are welcome to send him an email at thomas.jung@yukon.ca. And of course, at any time you can email the Wildlife Viewing Program, wildlife.viewing@yukon.ca, or fire some questions on Facebook, and we'll do our best to respond to you. And look for more information or opportunities to come help us perhaps look for pika. If you do find pika when you're out exploring, we'd love to hear about your sightings. As you can see, Tom is keeping records of all of these sightings, and it's how we can get a better understanding of their range and where they occur.
That's right. And if I could follow up with that,
You
Carrie,
can.
the Yukon Conservation Data Center does keep track of pika sightings. So if you do see pika and are able to take coordinates of it, the latitude and longitude, and send that information along with the data you're citing to the Yukon Conservation Data Center, they would be happy to use that data in helping to keep track of pika throughout the Yukon, anywhere in the Yukon, not just at those 3 parks that I said we're doing intensive work.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, alpine areas there's just so many, and it's hard to explore or survey them all. So as you're out exploring and enjoying the Yukon, if you see them and get a GPS point, we'd love to hear about that. All right. Well, thanks so much, Tom. Thank you for your time, and we'll catch up with you later on some more work that you're doing.
Thank you, Carrie.